Well, hello all, and welcome back to History of the Restoration Movement Archives. This is module number 18, and in this module we will be discussing Alexander Campbell, and specifically the early life of Alexander Campbell. Now, it cannot be stressed enough that Alexander Campbell is the premier thinker and writer of the first generation restorationists. And as such, there's really no easy way to include everything we need to include about Alexander Campbell in one specific module. And so over the next 3 or 4 weeks, we will be looking at different aspects of Alexander Campbell's life, ministry, and writings. And in this module, we'll specifically look at his transition from being an Irish schoolmaster and student to a frontier rural preacher preaching under the auspices of the Christian Association of Washington, and specifically as the lead pastor of the Brush Run Church. Now, this transition happens between 1809 and 1811, and it's really important to hammer this out because initially, Thomas Campbell, Alexander Campbell's father, intended for the church intended for the Christian Association of Washington not to become a church. It was meant to be a parachurch organization. And yet, as life and happenstance will play their parts, the Christian Association of Washington will become a full-blown church institution, totally free of other denominational ties. In short, it will become another church body, another sect, if you would like. And so this is a very pivotal transition in Alexander Campbell's life because it will set him up as the de facto leader of this Brush Run Church, and will basically set the stage for many of the confrontations and successes that he will have throughout his life. So, we should probably begin at the beginning. Alexander Campbell was born in 1788, the first child of Thomas and Jane Campbell, and he was born the son of a Presbyterian minister. So, in many ways, Alexander Campbell will grow up as a preacher's kid. For most of Campbell's life, his father Thomas will preach at the Ahori Church in Northern Ireland. And while his biography is somewhat obscure on the exact date, sometime before Thomas leaves to go to the New World, Alexander will have a saving experience. And this will be very much in line with what you would expect at a Presbyterian church. And so he will basically become convicted of his need for salvation. He will become convicted that he is a sinner and that everything that he does is evil. And then he will have this miraculous work of grace. This is often how Presbyterians will describe this, that the Holy Spirit somehow apprehended him. And in doing so, he had a conversion experience. And we don't have an exact date, but we can very easily place it before 1807. So Alexander Campbell will join his father's church, and they will both be Presbyterians. Now, early on, Alexander Campbell showed a remarkable aptitude for learning. However, he is the oldest child of what will eventually be 7 Campbell children, and as such, there just isn't the money to send him off to Glasgow University, where his dad studied. Now, this will eventually become a fulfilled dream for Campbell. But keep in mind that even without going to college, once his father leaves in 1807 to go to the New World, Campbell will take over the teaching duties that his father was doing at the local school. And so just keep in mind that even without having a substantial college education like his father, Campbell still seems to be very formidable academically, even if his paper credentials are lacking. Now, one of the big moments that's going to kind of start changing Alexander Campbell's world is the sickness that his father will experience over the disappointment between the burgher anti-burgher merger. In short, Thomas Campbell placed quite a lot of personal emotion and energy into making this merger happen. I mean, he traveled across the Irish Sea to Scotland several times. He had basically all of the meetings taken care of so that all of the burghers and anti-burghers in Northern Ireland were fine with the idea of a merger. And so Campbell had a lot of invested energy and emotion into this. And when the merger was denied by the General Council in Scotland, Thomas Campbell begins to fall very, very ill. And it will be Alexander Campbell who will suggest to his father maybe he would like to try out the missionary life in America. Interestingly, Alexander Campbell also tells his father that he intends to go to America as soon as he can, and that maybe it would be in Thomas Campbell's best interest to go ahead of the family and basically clear a path. Now, it's uncertain what Alexander Campbell expected he would do once he got to America. He will say in his own biography that he didn't experience a call to ministry just yet. But it is somewhat interesting to note that it is very much Alexander Campbell's idea that the Campbell family relocate to America after this disappointment with the burgher anti-burgher merger. Now, Thomas Campbell will leave for America in April of 1807, and basically this will promote Alexander to become the man of the house, and he will basically take up the teaching duties for the other 6 Campbell children, as well as many of the teaching duties for other students in Northern Ireland that were attending his father's school. And he's going to do this at the age of 19. Now, I know what you're thinking. How many 19-year-olds would I trust with a room full of kids? Let's just say that it was a different time and it was a different era. And Campbell does seem to be fairly mature for his age. So, in October of 1808, Thomas Campbell will send a letter back to the family in Northern Ireland, basically saying that he has set up shop in western Pennsylvania and that he would like for the entire Campbell family to relocate and move to America. Now, this will be the start of about a year-long expedition for the Campbells, that this is not going to be an easy move. In fact, there's going to be several moments where just the ships, the sea, and many other factors just will not cooperate to bring the Campbells over to America quickly. Now, contrast that with Thomas Campbell, who left in April, arrives in May. Alexander Campbell will leave in October of 1808, and they won't actually meet up with Thomas until October of 1809. So it's going to be a year-long move to get to America for the Campbells. Now, 5 days into their first voyage, the ship will run into a storm, and the ship will almost sink. And during this time, Campbell will report in his biography that he prayed a prayer that he promised to become a minister. Basically, his self-reflection in a dangerous situation is that he didn't really feel like he'd lived the kind of life that was complementary to his talents and his skills, and nor to his faith. And so Alexander Campbell will promise, basically swear an oath to God, that if he survives the storm, he will become a minister. Now again, this is also very, very typical of Presbyterian religion at the time. Just as a person cannot be saved unless God has chosen them, likewise, a person just can't decide one day, I'm going to be a minister, without having some kind of a moment that they can reach back to and say, that was the moment God called me. And so for Alexander Campbell, this storm will be the moment that he feels God has called him into the ministry. And so the ship is going to basically hit a sandbar, become scuttled. The entire family will be saved without any loss of life, and most of their property, including their books, will be salvaged. But the result is that Alexander Campbell, who previously had had no way to go to Scotland to study, is going to be forced to spend the entire winter in Scotland. So, making the most of a bad situation, the Campbell family will decide that they're going to spend the winter in the city of Glasgow, and specifically so that Alexander can attend one semester of college. Now, several local families will write what's called a letter of introduction for the Campbells. You see, back then, it's very difficult to say, hey, this person is on the level. You can't just, go on Facebook or LinkedIn and find their life history. And so what will often happen when you have a traveler traveling from country to country, or even from like a major city to a major city, you'll often have people write you what are called letters of introduction, basically prominent family members saying, this person is good at X, Y, and Z, help him out, he's good people. Well, this one of these letters of introduction that will be written for the Campbells will introduce them to a separatist minister named Greville Ewing. Now, he is a separatist, meaning that he is someone who has specifically split from the Presbyterian church, but yet may still have many Presbyterian doctrines. But as we're going to see, Greville Ewing is somewhat of a radical thinker for his day and age, and many of Ewing's ideas will begin to rub off on Campbell, even if they're somewhat subtle. Now, an interesting thing about Ewing is going to be one of the more popular preachers in Scotland. And specifically, he will have one of the biggest church congregations that meets in Glasgow. And this will be an interesting adjustment for Alexander Campbell, because when him and his family moved to Scotland, they will continue attending the cedar, anti-burgher, Old Light Presbyterian church. And they're going to basically find that this church is, well, for lack of a better term, spiritually dead, or at least spiritually on life support. That compared to his father's preaching, that they just don't feel that the preaching accomplishes much at their home church. But he will be very much impressed with the preaching and ministry of Greville Ewing. Now, a little bit of backstory. Ewing is a part of what is called the Haldane movement, a church movement founded by James and Robert Haldane. And Greville Ewing is going to be a part of this. Now, the Haldanes have all split from the Presbyterian church, and they practice something what is known as congregational polity. Their church is what's called a congregational church. And by that, we just simply mean that this is a church that is independent from a overarching hierarchy. And so therefore, in many ways, Ewing's church is Ewing's sole responsibility. And while they are connected with the Haldanes just can't show up and say, hey, we're doing this now, get on board. And so Campbell will in many ways become enamored with this congregational polity, that it is a efficient way to do whatever the Holy Spirit is leading you, to do what the Scriptures are telling you, without having to go through all of the hoops that you have to go through in a large hierarchical church. So, continuing the backstory on Ewing. Ewing was formerly a Presbyterian minister, and he broke with the Presbyterians sometime around the turn of the century, around 1898 or so. Now, by the time the Campbell family arrives, Ewing's preaching is impacting many, many people in the city of Glasgow. According to most sources, he's averaging somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people on any given Sunday. Simply put, Greville Ewing has a mega church about 150 years before the mega churches actually became something that was recognized as a thing. And he is going to be much, much more successful than other Presbyterian ministers in Glasgow. And this is going to start Campbell kind of scratching his head a little. You see, the Presbyterians are going to have this understanding that they are the one true church. And specifically that each subgroup in the Presbyterians, whether you be a burgher, an anti-burgher, an old light, a new light, a cedar, or whatever, each one of these groups is also going to state that they are the one true form of Presbyterianism, which, is a very divisive way of looking at things. And seeing the success of Greville Ewing's church is going to convince Alexander Campbell that maybe the Presbyterians aren't the only game in town. That maybe the Holy Spirit is working with more than just the Presbyterians. And specifically that the Holy Spirit is working with more than just the old light, anti-burgher, cedar Presbyterians. And so Greville Ewing will be instrumental in really just kind of bonding with the Campbells. Now, other ideas that we can trace back to Ewing are several, but the main ones are going to be Campbell will get the idea of congregational polity, specifically of individual standalone congregations that are not under a hierarchy. He will get the idea that the Lord's Supper should be practiced every week from this group. And another ministry idea he will get specifically from the Haldanes is that he will choose not to take payment when he preaches. And so many of these ideas that Campbell will stand on for most of his life can be directly traced back to this encounter with Greville Ewing and the Haldanes in Scotland. It should also be noted that specifically from Ewing, Campbell will get this idea of a strong reliance on a Bible-only hermeneutic. And by this, we mean that when Campbell is trying to figure out what is it that God wants a Christian to do, Campbell is going to take a page from the Greville Ewing playbook and say, that answer is found in the Bible and in the Bible alone. And specifically, Campbell will become very suspicious of philosophies, of creeds, and other things that are extra-biblical or outside of the Bible. And he will strongly stress this idea that if a church is going to be operating effectively and in a New Testament pattern, it must be following the Bible. And he'll even narrow this down further as he ages to it is only the New Testament that is the constitution and pattern for New Testament Christians. Now, in addition to Ewing, James Haldane, again, one of the founders of the Haldane movement, will introduce Campbell to some other ideas. Now, it's hard to say exactly how many of these ideas Campbell took to heart. It seems that he really doesn't really take any of these ideas to heart until he gets to North America. But just kind of let the record show that in his close proximity to the Haldane movement, he will be introduced to several ideas that are very controversial to Presbyterians. And from Haldane, he will get the idea that baptism should be for adult believers, and that it should be by immersion as opposed to sprinkling or pouring. And also, as we had noted before, he'll also get the idea from James Haldane that a minister should be kind of a tent maker in the model of Paul. And so Alexander Campbell will choose for the rest of his life when he preaches to preach the gospel without being paid. Now, it should be noted that Campbell will turn out to be somewhat of a financial genius. By the time Campbell dies, he will be one of the richest men in Western Virginia. But let the record show that he made it a practice not to be paid for preaching. So, Campbell will spend approximately half a year studying at the University of Glasgow. And he will start in November of 1808. And while he's there, Campbell will study many, we'll call them liberal arts type disciplines. He will study French. He will study Greek. He will study Latin. He will study English literature, but he'll also study philosophies. Specifically, he'll study the Baconian empiricism, or what we would call the scientific method, which was founded about 100 years previous to Campbell. And he'll also study a more, we'll call it current philosophical trend in Ireland, which is called Scottish common sense philosophy. And we talked about this a little in previous lectures, but let us just kind of state for the record that Campbell is learning a lot of, we'll call it, practical subjects that he can use as a Bible expositor and as a student of the Bible. Specifically, learning Greek will allow him to have access to the New Testament in its original form. Learning various types of philosophy will strongly imprint in Campbell this idea that a person can read a document and understand it. That all a person needs to do is know how to read, and a person can understand the meaning of a document, and specifically the author's intentions behind a document. Now, as we looked at earlier, this is not anywhere near as cut and dry, but again, the study of linguistics has changed pretty radically in the last 200 years. So when Campbell is learning these subjects, one of the things he will be taught is, simply put, if you want to understand a Greek sentence, you diagram the sentence and you get yourself a good dictionary or concordance, and you simply go to town. This will, in many ways, make Campbell a very formidable expositor on the American frontier. He will be one of the few people that can pull out a Greek New Testament and simply start reading. And this will give him quite an edge in Western Pennsylvania when he starts making his own splash. Now, when Campbell is in Glasgow, Scotland, he will eventually start to have his doubts about the Presbyterian Church. And several factors are going to build up over this half a year period that's really going to kind of push him to make a decisive break in April of 1809. And it basically goes like this. First, he sees the influence of Greville Ewing, that Ewing's ministry is exciting, it's dynamic, it's changing lives, and it's very, very different from what we'll call the boring or lackluster preaching that the Glasgow Presbyterians are offering. And so he's really going to start kind of doubting that the Presbyterians have a message that impacts people anywhere near what Greville Ewing is preaching. Second, he is going to pick up many of his father's frustrations that the Presbyterian Church is a very divided church. And every one of these groups, whether we're the Cedars, the regular Presbyterians, the Old Lights, the New Lights, anti-burghers, burghers, all of these people are claiming to be the one true Presbyterian Church. And this is going to frustrate Campbell to no end. And on top of this, because Campbell is a Irish national, i.e. he does not live in Scotland, there's really no one in Scotland who can personally vouch for his faith. when he goes to take communion, he's got to take a test. And these tests of fellowship require a person to be very literate. They require them to be very theologically astute as well. And Campbell will note that this will virtually keep anyone who is illiterate from ever being a Christian, at least in the eyes of the Presbyterians, and in many ways will say that the work of God, i.e., whoever God is accepting, has suddenly, this duty has been relegated to men, and specifically men grading a test. And Campbell is going to feel that this really kind of rubs him the wrong way, that who are these men, these presbyters, to tell me where my faith is? And so all of these factors are really going to kind of push Campbell in a direction to say, I don't know if I want to be a Presbyterian anymore. Now, let's talk about Scottish Communion feast. Now, as we had discussed earlier, many of them are based on this idea of the agape meal. And as such, the Scottish Communion feast really has as its primary focus a full meal. You sit down at a table, and you are served the elements of communion. Now, in Glasgow, these are usually very large gatherings, and specifically the 1809 gathering supposedly served around 800 people. Now, keep in mind that 800 people is a lot of people to be meeting for a church function. However, compared to Greville Ewing's church, it's about, a low Sunday. So, for what it's worth, this is the marquee thing the Presbyterians are doing that month. Now, Campbell's family, as we had noted, they're from out of town. They have to take a test, and Campbell will pass this test easily. Now, the problem is that once he takes this test and passes, he then will start to have a tinge of conscience. Because Campbell will take everything that he's been thinking up to this point. That, Greville Ewing may be just as much a Christian as the Presbyterians. That the Presbyterian church seems kind of dull and lackluster. And now they're making me take a test, and I can pass their test. But if they had asked me the question, well, do you think that the Presbyterians are the only church? He would have had to say no. And he wouldn't have been allowed to fellowship. And so Campbell will just kind of note that this test is completely arbitrary. One, because it cannot allow the Presbyterians to actually figure out who isn't one of their numbers, i.e., Alexander Campbell. But at the same time, it would keep people who may in fact be Christians from fellowshipping, simply because they were illiterate or were just not theologically astute. Now, when you go to these Scottish Communion feasts, they would give you a token. This was your proof that you were a member of the Scottish Church. And Campbell will sit down at the table eventually. He will wait in line, and he'll keep moving back and back and back. He'll basically, once it's finally the last turn to go, he'll sit down. He'll drop his token in the plate, but then he won't partake. And from this moment, even though Campbell, from the looks of all other good Presbyterians, will still be a Presbyterian, in Campbell's mind, from this moment, he has left the church. So that will be spring, specifically April of 1809. Now, in another month, by May of 1809, Campbell will finish his semester at the University of Glasgow. And that's all he's going to get, because the family will then prepare once more to go and travel off to America. So the Campbells will leave Scotland in August, and they will arrive in America on September 29th of 1809. Now, keep in mind that they haven't seen Thomas Campbell, Alexander's father, for about 2 years. And in this time, both Alexander Campbell and Thomas Campbell have, for their own reasons, left the Presbyterian Church. Thomas, of course, from last week's lectures, we found was excommunicated because he kept offering open communion. And, of course, Alexander Campbell, while not officially asked to leave the church, has, in his own mind, left because, well, all of those factors finally piled up, and he said, I am not in communion with this group. So, this makes for an interesting family gathering, that the family is going to get back together soon, and both father and son have something important to tell each other. They've left the Presbyterian Church. And specifically, they haven't left it for anything else. They're just gone from the Presbyterian Church. And as such, they're both looking to fill a church void in their life. And so just kind of one of those interesting ways that the Spirit may be working here, that both Campbells will find that they are both in agreement that the Presbyterian Church was something that, well, is better off without them, and that they will both be in this kind of searching mode of, well, what do we do next for the kingdom of God? So the Campbells will send word to Thomas, and they will make plans to basically hire a wagon to go all the way out to western Pennsylvania. Now, keep in mind that this is not, travel like you would have in modern day. So even though they arrive in September, it is going to take until almost a month later in October before they are actually reunited with Thomas Campbell. And specifically that they will be reunited with Thomas Campbell and he's riding out to meet them. So they will still have several more days of travel with Thomas as soon as they can get where they're going. Now, an interesting coincidence here. This is also approximately 1 month after Thomas Campbell has finished writing the Declaration and Address, which we looked at earlier. And this is also the official start of the Christian Association of Washington. And so Alexander Campbell will find out about this new ministry opportunity very quickly. And it's going to make him very excited because, as we noted, when he survived the storm, he promised he was going to become a preacher. Well, when you drop out of the Presbyterian Church, that kind of ruins your odds of having the Presbyterians ordain you to the priesthood, or at least to the pastorship. And so Alexander Campbell will read in his father's Declaration and Address that one of the primary focuses is the understanding that a person does not need ordination in order to preach the gospel. And this idea will really excite Alexander Campbell because he's been given quite a lot of tools for preaching the gospel at the University of Glasgow. And now his father's Declaration and Address is basically giving Alexander Campbell free rein to preach for the Christian Association of Washington without a preaching license, without a preaching credential from a denomination. And this will really excite him because instead of having to spend 3 or 4 more years at a seminary, Alexander Campbell can just really get to the business of preaching. And so for the next half a year, Alexander Campbell will begin a private study for the ministry. And he will basically allot himself basically an 8-hour day for doing educational tasks. The first 4 hours of the day are specifically for his own education. And so he'll be studying Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and just Bible study in general. And he'll be doing this for about 4 hours. And as far as we can tell, he starts this process really early, sometimes as early as 5 or 6 in the morning. And then after he is done with this 4 hours of study, he will then spend the next 4 hours teaching, that there will be both his younger brothers and sisters, as well as many other frontier people that are affiliated with the Christian Association of Washington, particularly a man named Abraham Alters, that Alexander Campbell will continue to teach how to read, write, and other liberal art oriented disciplines. And so Campbell will do this for approximately a half a year, that this will be simply his routine. And he will see this explicitly as his preparation for doing ministry. So eventually Campbell will preach his first sermon, and he will do so on July 15th of 1810. And he will preach the sermon to the Christian Association of Washington, and immediately Campbell will be noted as a preaching phenomenon. He will be flooded with requests to preach again. And in short, again, the year is already halfway over. It's July 15th. And he will be asked to preach so frequently that he'll end up preaching about 105 more times that year. So he's averaging 2 sermons every 3 days. And from what we've found from Alexander's papers and surviving sermon manuscripts, it seems that the majority, if not every one of these sermons, was a new sermon, that he is using his time of Bible study every morning, approximately 4 hours, and he's really honing in on this idea that he is going to preach something new, something fresh, something vibrant, as frequently as he can. So let us shift gears here for a second, though, because Thomas Campbell, Alexander's father, has created somewhat of a problem of unity when it comes to the purpose and the meaning of this new organization he's founded, the Christian Association of Washington. Specifically, he is concerned that this parachurch organization that he started is starting to function like a separate denomination. Now, to define a couple terms here, a parachurch organization is a Christian organization that supports a church, but is not a church in and of itself. Modern day examples would be things like the United Bible Society or the Gideons, groups that provide Bibles for Christians, and groups that, while they are Christians themselves, they employ Christians. They are not going to necessarily say, now, which denomination are you before you can work for us, or before you can receive a Bible from us. That's a parachurch organization. And Campbell will become worried that the Christian Association of Washington, while originally set out to be a parachurch organization, is going to start looking and functioning like a separate denomination. So, by October of 1810, Thomas Campbell will petition the Presbyterian Synod of Pittsburgh. Now, this is not the anti-burgher cedar Presbyterians. This is the regular, plain, old-fashioned, vanilla Presbyterian church. The group that has not had any splits as far as cedars, burghers, anti-burgher. It's just the Presbyterian Synod of Pittsburgh. And he will specifically ask for something very odd. He will ask for the Synod of Pittsburgh to sanction the Christian Association of Washington. And so basically they can form a Presbyterian church. But interestingly, Campbell is going to specifically say that they want to be Christians only. That they're not necessarily joining the Presbyterians. They're going to maintain their congregational autonomy, but they want to affiliate and specifically have the sanction of the Presbyterian Synod of Pittsburgh. Now, I don't know about you, but this is a very odd request, because the average Presbyterian is going to look at this request and say, this isn't how Presbyterianism works. To be a Presbyterian, you are under the authority of the Synod. You are under the authority of the Presbytery. and you do as the group decides. And so Campbell is basically saying we want Presbyterian sanction. We want to experience Presbyterian fellowship. But we don't want to be Presbyterians. And in many ways, the Presbyterians are going to look at this request and just roll their eyes and say, I don't even know what to do with this request. And in short order, by October 4th, the Synod will reject Campbell's request. And they'll give several reasons why they're rejecting it. First, they will say that Campbell will not affirm the Westminster Confession of Faith, because as per the Declaration and Address, Campbell will specifically shun the idea of creeds. And the Westminster Confession of Faith, being a creed, is something that he simply will not affirm. Now, interestingly, Campbell will believe almost everything from the Westminster Confession, minus some of the Calvinism. But let it just be stated for the record that he would not affirm any of it. Now, some of the other critiques that the Synod had were this. One, that Campbell claims that infant baptism is not the biblical mode. And so we see already by 1810 that Thomas Campbell is starting to note that infant baptism is not necessarily what the Bible teaches. The Synod will also critique Thomas Campbell that he is allowing his son Alexander to preach, even though Alexander is not ordained. Again, if you're in the Presbyterian Church, the only way that you are allowed to preach is if you have a license to do so. And they're specifically saying Thomas Campbell lets his son preach without a license. And that is, to the Presbyterians, a very dangerous way to have a loose cannon just running around in the pulpit. And they will again affirm that the Christian Association opposes all creeds. And again, they will not really know what to make of this, but many of them will fear that this is a kind of an anti-Trinitarian stance. But finally, the last of the Presbytery's critiques, I think, really hits home with the important Presbyterian notion that you join the Presbyterian Church or you don't, but you don't play free agent. Specifically, the Presbyterian Church was saying that they will not allow a minister to remain independent. And basically they're going to say the Campbells cannot just be Christians only. If they want to be Presbyterians, they would consider letting them join the Presbyterian Church. But they're not going to be mavericks. They're not going to be loose cannons. And they're going to be Presbyterians if they want Presbyterian sanction. Now, about a month later, on November 1st, the Christian Association of Washington will have its semi-annual meeting. And because it's after July 15th, Campbell will be one of the people preaching at this event. And Campbell will be somewhat angry at the rejection from the Pittsburgh Synod. And in his sermon, he will specifically focus on several of the rejection points and basically craft the Christian Association's answer to being rejected by the Synod. The first is he will look at this idea of them basically saying we don't want any mavericks running around, and he'll say, well, we were pursuing unity. The rejection is not our loss. It's their loss. That we were the ones trying to do in good Christian faith. We were the ones reaching out. And you know what? You can't make someone take your hand. So Campbell will basically chuck up the initial critique as being, we were trying. They weren't. If there's a problem, it's theirs, not ours. Now, he will specifically respond to the personal critique that he is not licensed to preach. And he will specifically note that the idea of ordination is not a New Testament concept. And therefore, he says, you can't hold me to preaching without a license, because there's no such thing as a license to preach in the New Testament. He will also further note that all of the congregations that are started in the New Testament practice what's called congregational polity. They don't have a synod or a presbytery looking over them. That the New Testament standard is not a Presbyterian standard. And so he'll basically say, we are trying to follow the New Testament. If they say we have to join the presbytery, we're going to say we're going to follow the New Testament. Again, it's their loss, not ours. And this is going to become a very pivotal idea in Alexander Campbell's thought, that him and his father, Thomas, to some degree, are going to demand this return to a New Testament order of things. And we'll discuss that a little bit more in future lectures. But just kind of keep in mind right now that the New Testament will become the driving force in Alexander Campbell's ministry. If we're going to do something, the New Testament has to sanction it. If we're going to not do something, the New Testament should prohibit it. And so, again, Campbell will use that in regards to the rejection from the Pittsburgh Synod, and he's going to say, look, if they don't want to follow the New Testament, the Scriptures, that's their loss. But we, basically taking a page from Joshua, as for me and my house, we're going to do what the New Testament says. If they don't want to do that, fine, but it's their loss. And again, he's going to focus on another interesting aspect, and he's going to say that in the New Testament there is no clergy distinction. There is no priestly class. And again, he's going to take this idea from Martin Luther that the priesthood of all believers means that everybody has the ability to act as priest of their own life, their own household. And as such, he is going to basically say the Presbyterian distinction of clergy versus not clergy is a worthless distinction. And so, in many ways, again, pointing this out, at least here, Alexander Campbell is responding to what he feels is a personal attack. You let Alexander Campbell preach, and he's not licensed. And he's going to say, well, I don't see a license in the New Testament. I don't see this idea of clergy in the New Testament. Who are you to tell me I can't preach? And of course he does this while preaching. And this will become kind of a hallmark of Alexander Campbell's preaching ministry. He's going to be somewhat of a feisty guy. And in many ways, he is going to have a very similar to Martin Luther rhetoric of show me chapter and verse in the New Testament where it says I have to do something or don't have to do something, and then we'll talk. But until you're actually doing that, we have nothing to talk about. Now, this sermon is going to be a really important moment of Campbell's life because, again, the Christian Association of Washington was founded by Campbell's father, Thomas Campbell. But after Alexander preaches this sermon defending the Christian Association from the Presbyterian naysayers, Campbell will really kind of gain a lot of respect and street credibility for this. And as such, many in the Christian Association will start to look to Alexander Campbell as their leader. And so, by May of 1811, a church will be founded at Brush Run, a small little creek in western Pennsylvania. And this Brush Run Church will become the official meeting house for the Christian Association of Washington. And so a certain irony has been created that a new church indeed was founded, even though the Declaration and Address had never intended for such a thing to happen. And largely it was out of necessity. They were trying to reach out. They were getting rejection letters. And so the question becomes, well, what do we do? And the answer is, well, we should continue in Christian worship and fellowship. And the only way to do that is to start our own church. And so in May of 1811, the Brush Run Church will start independent operations.